What if the deadliest battles in American history weren't fought between nations, but between neighbors? Hidden deep in the hollows, prairies, and pine forests, entire families turned the land into their own private war zones. No treaties, no surrender, just blood. These were wars the textbooks left behind because they were too brutal, too personal, and too close to home. Tonight, we're uncovering the blood-soaked legacies of 10 American family feuds. Conflicts so violent they rewrote local history and terrified entire regions. These weren't courtroom disputes. These were battles where the law never showed up. From the Texas plains to the Appalachian hills, some families ruled by the gun, while others survived only by vanishing into the woods. We'll explore wars that spanned decades, destroyed bloodlines, and in some cases, still echo through the descendants walking among us today. These are the stories you won't find in school books, because America never liked to talk about its blood feuds. In the years after the Civil War, Texas wasn't a peaceful place. Soldiers returned home to find their farms raided, their neighbors aligned with the other side, and the law scattered in pieces. In DeWitt County, two powerful families, the Suttons and the Taylors, stood on opposite sides of that broken world. The Suttons were Union loyalists, many of them serving as lawmen and federal sympathizers. The Taylors were ex-Confederates, ranchers who saw Reconstruction as an occupation. What began as political division quickly turned personal, and in the sun-scorched plains of South Texas, grudges were easier to hold than forgiveness. The first sparks flew in 1866 when William Sutton, a Texas lawman, led a posse that killed several suspected cattle thieves, men who just happened to be Taylor relatives. The Taylors called it murder. Sutton called it justice. But from that moment on, every death demanded another in return. Assassinations replaced trials. A man could be shot off his horse in broad daylight, his only crime wearing the wrong last name. Ambushes became a weekly occurrence, and funerals were as common as church picnics. The most dangerous part of the Sutton-Taylor feud was that no one was clearly the villain or the hero. William Sutton held a lawman's badge, but he also led vigilante raids that left bodies in his wake. John Wesley Hardin, one of Texas' most feared outlaws, rode alongside the Taylors, turning the feud into a magnet for gunfighters. In the chaos, townspeople lived in fear of both sides. Even weddings and Sunday services sometimes ended in gunfire. By the 1870s, DeWitt County had become a war zone masquerading as a cattle town. The violence reached its peak in 1873 when William Sutton himself was ambushed and killed at an Indianola wharf as he prepared to leave Texas for good. His murder was the Taylors' most public act of vengeance, and it shocked even those who had cheered them on. But his death didn't bring peace. Instead, it unleashed one final wave of bloodshed that left barns burned, cattle rustled, and families fleeing the county entirely. For nearly a decade, revenge ruled DeWitt County, and no one, not lawmen, not preachers, not governors, could stop it. Eventually, like all feuds, exhaustion replaced hatred. By the late 1870s, most of the Sutton and Taylor leadership was either dead, imprisoned, or had left Texas behind. The remaining family members slowly returned to ranching and rebuilding what was left of their communities. But the scars remained. The Sutton-Taylor feud had claimed more than 35 lives and left an entire county marked by blood and fear. And even today, in the dusty graveyards of South Texas, Sutton and Taylor headstones still sit apart, separated by death as they were in life. In the 1870, Lampasas, Texas, was a town caught between two versions of justice. On one side stood the Horrell brothers, outlaw cattlemen known for their hard drinking and quicker tempers. On the other side was Sheriff Shad Higgins, a determined lawman trying to bring order to a town that didn't want it. What began as bar fights and cattle disputes soon spiraled into a bitter feud where badges meant little and survival came down to who had the faster gun. For Lampasas, this wasn't just a battle between criminals and lawmen. It was a fight over who got to decide the rules. The spark came in 1873, when a confrontation at a Lampasas saloon turned deadly. Sheriff Higgins and his deputies attempted to arrest the Horrell brothers for cattle theft, but the standoff ended in bloodshed when the Horrells resisted arrest. 2 lawmen fell dead in the street, and the town's quiet, dusty roads became the setting for open gun battles. With the sheriff humiliated and outgunned, the Horrell brothers fled. But they weren't done. They gathered friends, fellow outlaws, and anyone who wanted to see Higgins fall, turning the dispute into a full-scale vendetta. In the months that followed, Lampasas became a town of shadows. The Horrell gang prowled the streets after dark, ambushing deputies, torching the property of Higgins' allies, and threatening anyone who sided with the law. For a time, the law retreated completely, Higgins and his men hiding in outlying ranches, waiting for the right moment to strike back. The town's citizens, caught in the middle, locked their doors and prayed that dawn would bring quiet. But night after night, gunfire echoed through the hills, reminding everyone that peace was far away. The feud reached its peak in 1874 when Sheriff Higgins and his supporters staged a daring ambush against the Horrell gang near the outskirts of town. What followed was one of the bloodiest shootouts in Texas frontier history. Rifles cracked from behind dry creek beds, pistols barked from behind fences, and by the time the smoke cleared, multiple men from both sides lay dead or wounded. The battle shocked Lampasas into silence. Neither side had truly won, but the message was clear. This was no longer a dispute over cattle. It was a personal war that wouldn't stop until someone was gone. By late 1874, the Horrell-Higgins feud finally began to burn out. Some say the constant bloodshed wore both sides down. Others say outside lawmen, tired of the chaos, threatened to bring the Texas Rangers into Lampasas if the killings didn't stop. The Horrell brothers slowly drifted out of the region, some heading west to New Mexico, others meeting their own violent ends in distant towns. Sheriff Higgins remained, but his control over Lampasas was never the same. The feud had left scars, empty storefronts, abandoned ranches, and too many graves with familiar names. For years after, people spoke the names Horrell and Higgins with caution, reminders of how quickly law and outlaw could trade places on the Texas frontier. In the isolated expanse of Pleasant Valley, Arizona, where pine forests cloaked steep ridges and rocky trails vanished into shadow, 2 families made the land their battleground. The Grahams and the Tewksburys had come to the valley seeking fortune in cattle ranching, but found only rivals in one another. The Grahams were pure cattlemen, fiercely territorial and intolerant of outsiders. The Tewksburys, partly of Native American descent and open to sheep herding, crossed an unspoken line when they allowed sheep to graze alongside cattle, a violation of frontier code. What started as a dispute over grazing rights quickly descended into a simmering hatred, fed by prejudice, pride, and survival. In this valley, where lawmen feared to tread, your family name decided whether you lived or died. The first shots came in 1882, over something as basic as water access. A Graham supporter fell dead on a dusty trail, and with him, the last hope for peace in Pleasant Valley. Instead of mourning, the families sharpened their rifles and fortified their camps. Hired guns joined both sides, among them men like Tom Horn, a notorious future Pinkerton agent, whose loyalties shifted with the highest bidder. From that moment on, the valley became a hunting ground where a man could be ambushed while tending cattle, riding for supplies, or simply crossing the wrong ridge. Justice, if it ever existed here, was buried along with the bodies. The feud tore through Pleasant Valley like wildfire, Brothers turned on brothers-in-law. Friends became assassins, and no family gathering was safe. The Grahams rallied cattlemen and cowboys from across Arizona territory, while the Tewksburys found allies in sheep herders, small ranchers, and outlaws tired of cattleman rule. Nights were marked by the glow of burning cabins, and days by the sharp crack of rifles echoing through the hills. During the brutal winter of 1886 to 87, snow and hunger drove men to desperation, isolating the valley even further. Survival hardened into vengeance, and vengeance knew no end. In 1887, the violence reached its cruelest peak. John Graham, one of the last Graham patriarchs, was ambushed on a lonely trail and left to the wilderness. His death marked the turning point. Ed Tewksbury, one of the last men standing from his side, allegedly tracked down and killed Tom Graham in the final act of the feud. By then, there were hardly any men left to fight. Both families had lost their sons, their fathers, and their future in a valley that could no longer sustain them. All that remained were graves and burned-out homesteads. When the Arizona territorial government finally sent marshals to Pleasant Valley, they found a war already ended not by law, but by death. Deputies who once avoided the valley now rode empty trails. Judges, long powerless to intervene, found no defendants left to prosecute. The conflict had burned itself out, leaving only the ruins of ranches and the silence of families destroyed. Justice never came to Pleasant Valley. It simply arrived too late to matter. Today, Pleasant Valley is quiet. Pines have reclaimed the trails where men once hunted one another, and wind whispers through forgotten graveyards where the Grahams and Tewksburys lie apart in death as they did in life. The Pleasant Valley War remains one of the bloodiest family feuds in American history, with death tolls estimated between 20 and 40, though many believe the real number was higher, buried beneath the silence of the hills. Unlike the famous Hatfields and McCoys, there were no victors here, only loss, only warnings carved into the land itself. For most of America, the Civil War ended in 1865, but in the tangled woods and dusty backroads of northeast Texas, the war's bitterness lived on. In towns like Pilot Grove and Clarksville, the flags may have been lowered, but the guns were never put away. Confederate veterans and Union loyalists returned home to find not peace, but enemies living across the fierce line. This wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a place where war became personal. And for Bob Lee and Lewis Peacock, two men standing on opposite sides of Reconstruction, peace was never an option. Bob Lee, a Confederate veteran, charismatic and stubborn, stood as the protector of Southern pride in Northeast Texas. On the other side was Lewis Peacock, a Union supporter and Freedmen's Bureau agent, working to enforce Reconstruction policies and protect newly freed slaves. Their feud began in politics, arguments over who should lead the community, but it quickly turned violent. Peacock accused Lee of undermining the federal government. Lee saw Peacock as a traitor who brought the enemy into their home. Neither man would back down, and their rivalry spread like fire through the towns and farms of Grayson and Fannin counties. The first killing came in 1867, when Lee refused to swear allegiance to the Union. Soon after, a friend of Lee's was gunned down on the road, the murder blamed on Peacock's allies. With no lawman willing to take sides, Lee gathered a band of Confederate veterans, and Peacock recruited Union loyalists and freedmen who trusted him for protection. Nighttime raids burned family homes. Daytime ambushes struck supply wagons on lonely trails. Whole families lived in fear, caught between a sheriff's badge that meant nothing and the bitter grudges of their neighbors. Northeast Texas became a war zone without front lines. Unlike the shootouts of the Wild West, the Lee-Peacock feud was fought in shadows. Men hid in thickets and ravines, laying traps for each other and striking when the odds were sure. Small towns became battlegrounds of whispers, where shopkeepers sold only to one side, and preachers prayed for peace that never came. Even churches split along loyalty lines, and by nightfall, the streets belonged to whoever had the faster draw. Lawmen either took sides or turned away, and for ordinary folks, safety meant staying silent or leaving town altogether. By 1869, the feud had consumed the region. Bob Lee, once the symbol of Confederate defiance, was ambushed near Pilot Grove, shot multiple times and left for dead. His fall sent shockwaves through northeast Texas. Some hoped his death would end the violence, but instead, it fueled one last burst of vengeance. Lee supporters launched retaliatory strikes against Peacock's allies, burning what little was left of peace in the region. 2 years later, in 1871, Lewis Peacock met the same fate, gunned down outside his home by unknown assailants, likely Confederate sympathizers seeking revenge. Peacock's death closed the bloodiest chapter of the feud. With both leaders gone, the fight finally began to fade. But the scars they left behind cut deep into the county's soil. Historians estimate that over 50 people died during the Lee-Peacock feud, though many deaths went unrecorded, lost in the backroads and burned homes of rural Texas. Some were rival gunmen, but many were ordinary townsfolk or freedmen caught in the crossfire. Others died simply because they shared the wrong last name. This wasn't just a personal feud. It was the Civil War's unfinished business, spilling into daily life long after the flags came down. Today, Northeast Texas has rebuilt, but the names Lee and Peacock still linger in the soil and in whispered family stories. In places like Grayson and Fannin counties, you'll still find people who won't speak those names in the same sentence. The towns have grown quiet, but the memories of a war that refused to die still cast shadows over their history. In the tangled swamps and orange groves of central Florida, where the humid air hangs thick and law traveled slowly, a feud erupted between two families who once shared Sunday pews. The Barbers and the Mizelles began as neighbors, but became bitter enemies when disputes over cattle taxes and property boundaries turned deadly. The year was 1870, and the scars of the Civil War were fresh in the South. Here, amid the Spanish moss and cypress trees, honor meant more than law, and revenge was a debt paid in bullets. The feud boiled over when David Mizell, the local sheriff and a former Confederate officer, attempted to collect taxes from the Barber clan, who refused to recognize the Reconstruction government's authority. On a hot February morning, Mizell rode alone through Barber land, trusting the promise of peaceful negotiation. Instead, he was ambushed near a cypress-lined pond, gunned down in the swampy thickets. Local legend says Mizell fell from his horse calling for peace, but found only the silence of the woods. Mizell's death ignited a blood feud that spread like wildfire across the region. His family and the Allies vowed revenge, launching raids into Barber territory, burning homes, and driving cattle from disputed lands. The Barbers retaliated with ambushes deep in the swamps, where tangled roots and thick fog turned every trail into a trap. Lawmen were powerless, either siding with one family or hiding from both. 4 years, Central Florida's backcountry became a no-man's land where the law gave way to the rifle. Unlike many feuds romanticized in folklore, the Barber-Mizell conflict had no heroes. Both families committed brutal acts, and the violence spiraled beyond its original cause. Friends betrayed friends, neighbors spied on neighbors, and what began as a tax dispute grew into a generational war fueled by pride and fear. The swamps swallowed up evidence, and rumors filled the void where truth might have lived. Even children grew up knowing which parts of the woods were safe, and which might hide a waiting rifle. By the late 1870s, exhaustion finally replaced vengeance. Too many graves lined the churches and backroads of Orange and Brevard counties, and the land itself seemed tired of the fight. Some members of the Barbers and Mizelles sought peace, marrying into distant families and moving westward. But for decades after, the feud lingered in whispered warnings and family stories told by firelight. Never cross Barber Land, and if you do, don't ride alone. In the rolling hills of North Georgia, where pine forests give way to rocky pastures and isolated farms cling to red clay soil, the Evans and Powell families carved out their lives. At first, they were neighbors who tolerated each other's presence. But as the years wore on, disputes over land boundaries, cattle crossings, and family honor turned neighborliness into open hostility. By the 1880s, lines were drawn not just across fields, but across bloodlines. In these hills, the law was a distant rumor, and a man's reputation carried more weight than any courthouse decree. The feud erupted over something as simple and as deadly as a fence line. When a Powell-built fence cut across an old Evans cattle trail, what should have been settled in court was settled with fists and gunfire. The first fatal shot rang out at the edge of a pasture, leaving a Powell son dead in the red dust. At the funeral, Evans' men rode past the cemetery in full view, rifles resting across their saddles. It was not just a funeral, it was a warning. In the months that followed, the woods of North Georgia became hunting grounds. Ambushes replaced conversations, and blood stained the trails where children once played. The Powells struck back by torching an Evans barn under the cover of darkness, while the Evans family returned fire by ambushing a Powell wagon hauling lumber to town. Entire families slept in shifts, rifles propped by the door, waiting for the next attack that could come at dawn or dusk. Local sheriffs made a show of trying to stop the violence, but few had the stomach to arrest either family. Juries were stacked with cousins, and witnesses vanished into the hills before they could testify. The feud wasn't just personal, it was political, economic, and generational. The very soil of Georgia seemed soaked with old grudges, and no one, not pastors, not judges, not neighboring farmers, could make the Evans and Powells stand down. By the turn of the century, exhaustion finally did what the law couldn't. Too many sons had been buried, too many homes rebuilt from ashes. Both families retreated deeper into their remaining lands. Their fortunes diminished and their numbers thinned. Yet even decades later, locals would tell visitors to stay clear of the old Powell land after dark, and Evans' kin would whisper warnings to their children. There are debts in these hills, still waiting to be paid. In the forested hills of eastern Kentucky, the small town of Moorhead sat quietly at the crossroads of ambition and blood. In the 1880s, this was a place where personal grudges could shape public office, and family loyalty meant more than the law. The Martins, a family of merchants and politicians, clashed with the Tollivers, a clan of landowners and former Confederate sympathizers. What began as an argument over a courthouse election spiraled into a war where churchyards, schoolhouses, and saloons became battlegrounds, and no family was left untouched. The spark came in 1884, during a heated local election. Frank Martin accused the Tollivers of rigging the vote, while the Tollivers claimed the Martins bought their power with lies. Tensions exploded outside the courthouse when rival supporters drew pistols in broad daylight. When the smoke cleared, several men lay bleeding on the courthouse lawn, and the first chapter of Rowan County's private war had been written in blood rather than ballots. In the years that followed, no part of Moorhead was safe. The Tollivers hunted Martins in the streets, while the Martins retaliated in back alleys and backcountry roads. Saloons closed their doors after dark, and church sermons ended early when gunshots cracked through the trees. Even children learned which family names could get you killed for speaking too loud. The law, caught between warring kinfolk, chose survival over justice. Deputies resigned, judges fled, and the streets belonged to whichever family controlled the shadows that day. What made the Rowan County War so brutal was how it tore through bonds of friendship. Neighbors who once worked side by side now laid traps for one another. One day's hunting trip became the next day's ambush. In 1887, the violence peaked when Craig Tolliver, the powerful family patriarch, was shot dead in the streets of Moorhead by a group of men who once called him friend. His death shattered what little stability remained, leaving Rowan County a fractured and bitter place. With the Tolliver leadership gone and the Martins scattered by grief and fear, the feud slowly lost its fire. By the 1890s, Rowan County began rebuilding its streets, but its soul remained fractured. Old bullet holes scarred church doors, and families kept their rifles close, just in case. Even today, some say Rowan County was built twice, once by ambition and again by blood. And in those quiet Appalachian hills, the echo of those gunshots can still be heard, if you listen long enough. In the rolling hills of the Cookson Hills, deep within the Cherokee Nation of Indian Territory, two powerful families vie for control, not over cattle or fences, but over the future of their people. The Cooksons, tied to traditional Cherokee leadership, sought to protect tribal sovereignty against outsiders. The DeVaces, aligned with mixed-blood merchants and white settlers, pushed for modernization and cooperation with federal agents. What began as political debate in council meetings soon spilled into the forests and creeks, where loyalty was tested not by votes, but by bullets. The first clash came along Flint Creek, where a Davis messenger was ambushed under the cover of dense oak and sycamore trees. What should have been a peaceful exchange of council resolutions ended in gunfire, scattering papers into the water and leaving the hills echoing with rifle shots. The message never made it to the capital, and with it, the last hope for peace washed downstream with the autumn leaves. The Cookson-Davis feud tore through the heart of Cherokee territory, pitting kin against kin. Entire towns took sides, some raising the flag of traditional law, others welcoming the influence of white merchants and railroad men. Gunfights broke out at trading posts and river crossings. Even sacred council grounds became places of whispered threats. In a land already scarred by displacement and broken treaties, this feud added another bitter chapter to Cherokee history. The Cherokee Nation's own lawkeepers, the Light Horsemen, tried to contain the violence but found themselves overwhelmed and outgunned. Tribal courts issued warrants that no one dared enforce. U.S. Marshals ventured into the hills only in large numbers, and even then, few arrests stuck. The territory became a patchwork of guarded farms, fortified cabins, and backcountry trails where justice depended on who controlled the high ground. By the 1890s, exhaustion and outside pressure finally cooled the feud's flames. Federal intervention and the coming of the Dawes Act shifted the battle from rifles to land allotments, breaking Cherokee lands into individual plots and eroding tribal unity. Both the Cooksons and DeVaces faded into the broader struggle for native survival in a country that had already claimed their land once before. In the end, the feud left no victors, only fractured families and a fading culture fighting to hold on to what little remained. In the shadowed ridges of East Tennessee, where thick forests cling to steep hillsides and rocky trails wind between isolated farms, the Hall and Stone families carved their lives into the wilderness. Both clans were fiercely independent, both claimed the ridge as their birthright, and neither was willing to yield an inch. What began as disputes over timber rights and hunting grounds turned into whispered threats, midnight standoffs, and a war that turned neighbors into enemies. Here, the ridge itself seemed to take sides, hiding ambushes beneath its ancient oaks. The feud ignited when a stand of valuable hardwood trees on the ridge was cut without agreement. Accusations flew, and in the spring of 1893, the first shots were fired near a logging camp at dawn. Horses scattered, tools were abandoned, and the hillside echoed with gunfire that left the ground soaked in more than sap. From that day forward, every axe that fell in those woods could spark another fight. As the feud escalated, The hollow between the Hall and Stone properties turned into a dangerous no-man's land. Men traveled in pairs, never alone. Crows circled the ridge tops, their cries mingling with the distant crack of rifles. Families posted lookouts along tree lines, and even children learned to track footprints in the mud. The hollow, once filled with birdsong and timber workers, became a place where survival depended on silence and shadows. Local lawmen tried to mediate, but the badge meant little where blood loyalty ran deep. The county sheriff, once a friend to both families, found himself trapped between them. Deputies deserted, and court summonses were ignored or met with laughter. In one infamous encounter, the sheriff himself was run off the ridge by masked men who warned, "Leave this ridge alone. It settles its own debts." By the early 1900s, exhaustion and outside pressure finally thinned the fire. Many of the Hall and Stone men either died, fled, or grew tired of burying kin. The timber companies eventually bought up much of the disputed land, cutting the forest down to stumps and leaving the ridge scarred but quiet. Today, the hollow is still and overgrown, with only broken fence posts and the fading echoes of gunfire to remind passers-by that once, the woods themselves chose sides. In the rugged borderlands of western Missouri, where rolling fields met tangled thickets, the towns of Coldwater and Riverbend stood as uneasy neighbors. The Simmons and Parker families controlled rival territories across this border country, land where old Civil War loyalties still burned hot. The Simmons were Confederate veterans turned cattlemen. The Parkers, Unionists who built their fortune through river trade and law enforcement. On the dusty roads between their homesteads, a man's last name was enough to mark him for trouble. The feud ignited in 1875 over a river crossing where cattle drivers clashed with Parker's toll collectors. What started as a heated argument turned deadly when shots rang out across the water, seeing livestock scattering and traders fleeing into the brush. The Simmons retaliated by building their own unlicensed crossing upriver, cutting into Parker profits and setting the stage for a bitter and violent contest for control of the border. As the feud escalated, the Missouri River became both battleground and escape route. Simmons' men guarded the north banks with rifles, watching for Parker ferrymen by moonlight. The Parkers, in turn, used the river fog to run covert shipments of goods and cattle, sometimes sneaking across the Simmons lands under the cover of night. The river no longer belonged to the people, it belonged to the feud. Caught between the two families was the Coldwater sheriff, who tried and failed to keep peace along the border. Deputies from both towns resigned rather than face ambush on country roads, and juries refused to convict when family ties ran deep. Eventually, the sheriff was forced to pick a side, aligning himself with the Parkers and becoming a target of Simmons' vengeance. Law in this feud was just another faction. By the 1880s, exhaustion and economics finally cooled the feud. River trade shifted, the cattle trails moved west, and younger generations wanted peace more than payback. But the scars remained. Today, the Missouri River still winds quietly between the towns, its foggy mornings hiding the echoes of a war where two families nearly tore their world apart. And though peace returned, old-timers will tell you, on some nights, when the river runs low, you can still hear distant gunshots in the fog. In the quiet corners of America, beyond the battlefields, beyond the history books, there are scars left by those who fought their neighbors instead of foreign armies. Places where a family's name meant life or death, where the law wasn't absent. It simply wasn't welcome. These feuds didn't change the world like great wars did. But in their isolated valleys, deep forests, and forgotten towns, they changed everything for those who lived and died there. And yet, how many of these names have you heard before today? Atfield and McCoy, sure. But the Grahams of Pleasant Valley? The Raines family in the West Virginia woods? The blood that stained those lands still lingers in forgotten cemeteries. faded newspaper clippings, and the quiet stories passed down by families who survived. So now I ask you, which feud surprised you the most? Which one left you wondering what it would have been like to live in a place where peace was only as strong as your next bullet? There are places where these stories still echo in the wind. Abandoned farmhouses where doors creak without a breeze. Overgrown trails where footsteps stop, but never turn back. Would you dare visit them? History isn't always written by kings and presidents. Sometimes, it's written in lead and blood, carved across generations, and then quietly buried, waiting for someone to remember.